welcome you to our fourth event in our summer speaker series. And today I'm very pleased to introduce David Palumbo Liu and his talk, Living Together in Times of Crisis, Pandemic and Racism. David Palumbo Liu is the Louise Hewlett Nixon Professor and Professor of Comparative Literature at Stanford University. Besides publishing 6 books, many of them on the topics that we're going to hear from him about today in his lecture, he's written for The Washington Post, The Nation, The Guardian, Al Jazeera, BuzzFeed, Salon, and many other wonderful publications. He's currently writing a book on the idea of political voice. After David's talk, we'll have a Q&A where you'll be able to ask him some questions directly. And with that, I will hand it over to David.
Good to be here. Thank you for joining us. This time last year, and Patricia and I were just remembering we were sitting outside and sharing food, and I was giving a talk to summer school students and exchanging ideas. And to think of coming back this year and giving the same talk just didn't make sense to me, because what made more sense is to try to understand our contemporary historical situation. And so 2 big things happening right now, more than that obviously, but 2 ones that have really grabbed the headlines. And one is the pandemic, which is frightening and seems to be uncontrollable and has disrupted life as we know it and has changed the world. And we're not sure when normalcy is ever going to come back, if at all. And then the demonstrations against police violence that started in the United States but have become global and have continued. And so I thought that we should talk about both. And then I was faced with the task of figuring out how to put them together. How can we talk about these 2 seemingly very different things in a meaningful way? And so the course I'm teaching in the summer is called Human Rights and Global Literature. And in it, I try to show how literature can help us understand human rights, not from a legal point of view, but rather from a more humanistic point of view. And so I'll be blending that into my talk today, which is really about the importance to understand this shared historical moment and address some of these dangerous issues, including climate change, and to try to figure out how we can work together to solve these problems, because it's very clear that they're not being solved and they can't be solved by a small group of people. And that it's depressing to me to think of students like yourself or any public citizen feeling that the power to change things is beyond you, which is not at all true. And one very clear example is the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, because polls have shown that as recently as 5 years ago, the majority of Americans felt that race relations had improved, and people were not supportive of the idea that Black Lives mattered, because they felt that that negated the more important message, which is that all lives mattered. But after the demonstrations have taken hold of our political lives, it switched in a dramatic way. 65% of those polled in America now support Black Lives Matter. And it's very clear that 2 things happened to trigger that. One was the graphic representation of the murder of George Floyd. It put before the world what people had been talking about for so long. But the other thing that changed people's minds was seeing all these other people on the streets, people that were very different age groups, very different ethnic and racial backgrounds, in metropolitan spaces, but also in small cities and in rural areas. And just feeling that sense that the outrage and the sadness over the killings was not restricted to just yourself or a small group of friends, but was shared by many people, what might perfectly legitimately be called a global community. gave the made it possible for people's minds to be changed. And so I'll be tapping into that a lot in my comments. Now, I'm going to give you a little, just a short bit on human rights, the modern human rights. You've all heard of the United Nations. Well, the United Nations came into existence after the end of the Second World War. And one of its main goals was to prevent another war. And it felt that it was particularly important because science had discovered the atom bomb. So a war, the war of the future, the war that was meant to be forever postponed, if the United Nations was to do its work, that war, everybody knew, would be catastrophic in ways that nobody else had been able to imagine prior to that moment. And when you think of war today, you think of things like biological warfare. So the more the technology is able to know of the world, the more we come to know that mutual destruction is more and more possible and easy. So the United Nations set themselves up, and there was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. But and the main notion of uniting nations was to find out what our common interests were and how we could work toward removing obstacles toward realizing those common interests. And sadly but surely, in the course of time, it became clear that there was no real United Nations. There was no world community that could put a brake on the individual aspirations of different nations and different states. And after the end of the Second World War, we saw the breakdown of empires like the British Empire. The Ottoman Empire had crumbled before then, of course, but it fell into more and more disarray. The French Empire, others. And these new nation states started to emerge, and they all, or most of them, portrayed themselves as liberating their people. But sadly, in many of those cases, liberators then became oppressors. Once they got into power, they forgot their ideals, and maybe they didn't have the ideals to begin with. And so there was a moment in the late 60s and early 70s when a great deal of hope, but also a great deal of skepticism comes out at the same time. And I'm going to quote two things right now. One is from a novel, and the other one is from a speech. And they're written by the same person. And the person is Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who is a very famous Colombian author. And in the late 60s, he wrote a novel that maybe some of you have heard of. It's called 100 Years of Solitude. And 20 years later, he got the Nobel Prize. And I'm going to be reading from the speech that he gave before the Nobel community. And in the novel, which is a marvelous novel, it's a real indictment of selfishness. That's the best word, because in the whole long course of the novel, people keep on being unable to work together, but rather they're always putting their own priorities, their values, their groups before any sense of the opposite of solitude, which is solidarity. And at the end of the novel, and I'll read you the last few lines, it's a pretty horrifying ending to the novel. It's a strange passage, and I won't try to explain all the things that are going on. But basically what happens is that one of the characters, who has been one of the two main characters of the novel, finds the novel involves these parchments, these pieces of paper with these strange hieroglyphics on them. And the climactic scene of the novel, this character is alone in this musty room with these crumbling manuscripts, and he finally begins to be able to decode them. And here's what the author says, quote, Before reaching the final line, however, he already understood that he would never leave that room. For it was foreseen that the city of mirrors, or mirages, would be wiped out by the wind and exiled from the memory of men at the precise moment when he would finish deciphering the parchments, and that everything written on them was unrepeatable since time immemorial and forever, because those condemned to 100 years of solitude do not have a second opportunity on earth. Okay, so very chilling, right? And the book has been compared to the Bible in the sense that it is episodic, and it starts with the beginning of creation and ends at this moment. And what Garcia Marquez is actually saying is that in Latin America, which has just emerged from 20 years of horrible violence, the violence was going to continue because, again, everybody was self-enclosed and unable to understand the principles or the values of working together in solidarity. So that's the novel. 20 years later, here's Gabriel Garcia Marquez speaking before the Nobel Committee. Quote, "A new and sweeping utopia of life, where no one will be able to decide for others how they will die, where love will prove true and happiness be possible, and where races condemned to 100 years of solitude will have, at last and forever, a second opportunity on earth." So if you paid attention to the endings of both of those passages, you'll see that one negates the other. The first one in the novel, 1960s, no second opportunity, that's it. And in the speech 20 years later, he's saying, no, you will have a second opportunity. There will always be a second opportunity. And so here we are 35 years later, and I feel like we're running out of opportunities, frankly, right? Especially with climate change. We've had that many more years, decades even, to try to resolve these issues of competitiveness, of egotism, of narcissism, and we haven't made a lot of progress, at least not sufficient progress to meet the task of surviving and to have a world and an earth that will be habitable and nurturing. So in the 1980s, exactly at the time that Garcia Marquez is delivering this speech, we're at the beginnings of what, and this is a word I'm sure you've heard, but probably don't quite grasp because it's a complicated concept, which I'll try to parse for you. It's called neoliberalism. Neoliberalism. And there are many definitions of it, but it boils down to there's a great consensus on what it actually means. And the way I would express this, and again in the Q&A, I'm happy to give you the longer history of neoliberalism and what differentiates it from liberalism, but it assumes that nearly all, if not all human activity is a form of economic calculation, and so can be assimilated to the master concepts of wealth, value, exchange, cost, and especially price. And everything, in other words, everything that one does in life is predicated on a calculation to optimize the result. And it fits right into an economic modeling of human activity. Prices are a means of allocating scarce resources efficiently, according to need and utility, as governed by supply and demand. For the price system to function efficiently, markets must be free and competitive. Ever since Adam Smith imagined the economy as an autonomous sphere, the possibility existed that the market might not just be one piece of society, but society as a whole. Right? All of society can be understood as an economic organism, so to speak, with people trading commodities and energy and products exchanging them to the benefit of all. Within such a society, men and women need only follow their own self-interest, right? You are your own best guide to getting what you want, and what you want will aggregate into the best for society. Through competition, it becomes possible to discern who and what is valuable. I think that's a very, very important. This is that last line is from a sociologist named Will Davies. It becomes possible, if you accept the values and the logic of neoliberalism, to discern who and what is valuable. So I want us to pay attention to just not only the what, because we're used to assigning objects value, right? A BMW is more valuable than a Volkswagen, just to give you an example. But what happens when we start assigning value to human beings based on an economic calculation? In other words, how much value they bring into our lives can be quantified. And my argument here is that neoliberalism, which we associate with the 1980s, and we know now has grown and grown and grown and grown to become the dominant ideology in politics and economics and everything else. And you probably feel somewhat the flavor of neoliberalism when you think about what careers you're going to embark upon, what's going to earn you the money, right? So, which is not, and I don't dismiss that, that's an important calculation, but neoliberalism makes that the dominant calculation in everything. So that even friendships are cost calculated depending on how much time they will take away from your pursuit of your college degree. To me, and this is what will be basically the rest of my talk today, neoliberalism is inherently antisocial, anti-solidarity, and anti-democratic. And let me take that last piece and spell that out for you. The word democracy comes from the Greek, two words, demos and kratia. It means the people rule. Democracy signifies the aspiration that the people, and this is what's important, that the people and not something else, the people and not something else, order and regulate their common life through ruling themselves together, through ruling themselves together. That's the solidarity piece, right? Conversely, democracy negates the legitimacy of rule by part of the people rather than the whole. For example, only those with property, wealth, education, or expertise, or by any other external principle such as power, gods, violence, truth, technology, or nationalism. So if you have an ideology that is saying that economic behavior and that is geared towards economic value, achieving economic value, is the organizing principle of societies, then it has substituted the value of the market for the value of democracy. Because remember, democracy is based on equality, right? No one member of the society is more valuable than the other. Well, what happens with neoliberalism is that, as we just heard, it assigns value to certain people over and above others. And thus, democracy is impossible, right? Because the flourishing of the state is geared toward the flourishing of a small number of people and not everybody. And you might think this is a new thing, but let me quote something from Martin Luther King. And this is from 1965. So this is about the same time that Garcia Marquez is writing 100 Years of Solitude. And King says, quote, we must rapidly begin to shift from a thing, he calls it a thing-oriented society, to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. I'll repeat that. The giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. when computers, profit motives, property rights are considered more important than people. King goes on, call it democracy or call it democratic socialism, but there must be a better distribution of wealth within this country for all of God's children. So here's King giving us a counter vision to neoliberalism and the valuation of life according to profit, material wealth, and status. So let's turn to the pandemic. I thought that climate change would nudge people out of their self-interest. You know, when you see the whole world being affected by something and yourself, in other words, no matter whether you're rich or not, you too are going to be subsumed into this larger environmental devastation. But that hasn't happened, right? I mean, that's why we have climate change. And that to me is a signal, again, that we've lost a sense of community and being together, not just between humans, but between humans and other life forms and with the environment itself. And Jane Goodall spoke to the French press during the pandemic, and she said, there's a connection here. She said, it is our disregard for nature and our disrespect of animals that we should share the planet that has caused this pandemic. That was predicted long ago. Because as we destroy, let's say, the forest, the different species of animals in the forest are forced into a proximity, and therefore diseases are being passed from one animal to the other. And that second animal is then more likely to infect humans as it is forced into closer contact with humans. In other words, as climate change accelerates, it creates not only what we call climate refugees in terms of human beings who no longer have a habitat, but the same thing with animals, right? They're forced out of their habitat into places that they can't exist, or they exist only in very mutated forms, and they pass on those genetic mutations to others. And so the whole balance of nature, like the balance of democracy, has been upended. And as early as 2014, some journalists warned of, quote, zombie diseases of climate change, by which they meant a newly active permafforest is packed with old stuff, dead plants, dead animals, mosses buried and reburied by dust and snow. In this matter, long protected by the from decomposition by the cold is finally rotting. In other words, all these materials used to be frozen, and so they were sort of held in suspension, and they weren't decomposing because they were frozen. As the ice melts, they start to decompose. They become organic matter, again, live organic matter. And so whole new viruses are being created that had been safely sealed away. And during this devastation, what happens, which is positive, is that there's something, a scholar here at Stanford called it a community of fate. And I'm just going to read this passage from her, because she says, quote, we are a community of fate that COVID-19 has created. Our destinies are now clearly entwined as we're joined together to fight this virus and protect ourselves and our societies. The pandemic makes us aware of our reliance on and obligations to a wide network extending beyond family, friends, and neighbors to all those who contribute to our healthcare, supply chains, education of our children, etc. Even the invisible workers are becoming visible. The grocery clerks, the cleaners, the sanitation personnel who make it possible to survive and thrive. Such a community of fate can cut across polarization and become the basis of mobilization for the policies to start flourishing. What did she mean by all that? Remember before I talked about democracy and equality and valuing people equally because we are part of a society. And as neoliberalism and neoliberal values kick in and become dominate, we begin grading people by, a different system of values. And what Margaret Levy means by having invisible people come out, we realize how dependent we are on others in this very stressful time. For example, we talk about the need to find a vaccine. Well, you don't invent a vaccine in your backyard. You need a lab, and you need a lab that's sterile and a lab that is safe and one that is clean. And somebody needs to make the labs clean and to sanitize, sterilize the instruments and everything else. And that interdependency has been lost the more and more we only value the people, the scientists, the PhDs, right? Yes, we need them, but we also are reliant on a whole support system, just the way that environmentally, human life is dependent on all sorts of other life forms and an atmosphere. Let's see, I think there's somebody in Q&A. Okay, let me just wrap up. I'm going on longer than I thought. Let's talk about race. And one thing is, one of the objections to Black Lives Matter has been, why you say all life matter? Why particularize Black people, right? Why not talk? And you might say, well, listen, David, you've just been talking about solidarity and egalitarianism and everybody is the same thing. So why talk about Black Lives Matter? Why support that notion that separates Black lives from others? Because I want us to think about the presumptions about both phrases. All lives matter is predicated on an absolutely egalitarian society where there is no differentiation. And if we lived in a world like that, then I'd say, yes, all lives matter. And I would extend it to animals and to a broader panorama. But what the murder of George Floyd showed us is that not just recently, but from the very beginnings of slavery, not just in the United States, but any society that views other human beings as merely sources of labor rather than as equals. Ever since that happened in the United States, Black lives have not mattered. I'll tell you one historical fact. There's a wonderful novel by Toni Morrison called Beloved, and it's written based on a historical case. And the historical case was of a woman, a slave named Margaret Gardner, who took her 3 children and escaped to a free state, Ohio. And when she saw the slave catchers coming after them, I mean, they sort of successfully escaped for a number of weeks or months even. And then she saw that the law was going to come in and take her and her children back into slavery. She started to kill her children. She just felt that living under slavery was more painful than death. And she was only successful in killing 1. They captured Margaret Gardner and they put her on trial. And she was found guilty, but she wasn't found guilty of murder. She was found guilty of destruction of property. So even the murder of a human being was not considered that because Blacks were not considered to matter as humans, but only as property. So Black Lives Matter is simply trying to say, given the enormous fatality of being Black and the danger of being Black in America, we want to assert the fact that contrary to the way we've been treated for hundreds of years, Black Lives Matter. And I'll just end with this. You probably remember the episode of a couple months ago of Amy Cooper, who was a white woman in Central Park, New York. and she was walking, well, she had a dog, but the dog was running loose and not on a lead, and a black man asked her to please put her dog on a lead, which is the law. And she said he was harassing her. She got into an argument. She phoned the police, and she said, a black man is attacking me. Okay. That shows, among other things, that she knew darn well that the law doesn't feel Black Lives Matter. She knew that by putting in that complaint and tapping into a narrative, and here we come back to literature, into a narrative in which Black men are always threats to white women, and that the police are on the side always of the white against the Black. And it's very likely, given the historical record, that the police would not only come, but given the way she was exaggerating the situation and distorting it, they would likely kill him. So she weaponized that whole history of racism and police brutality against this other individual. So the message of Black Lives Mattering is meant not to be a personal issue, but to point out systemic weaponizing of what we call the justice system against some. I see that it's almost 40 minutes into my talk. I could keep on talking, but I'm going to stop here because I do want to have a conversation, and I have lots of other things to say that I could fill in, but I want to hear from you in terms of things that interest you. So I'm just going to stop.
Thank you, David. And I'm going to go ahead and enable the chat right now so that all of the attendees can show your gratitude towards David for a wonderful talk. We're going to begin the Q&A portion now. The first question we have here is, can you explain the difference between neoliberalism and capitalism?
Capitalism is an economic system, right, in which the owners own the means of production and workers work to under the mandates of owners. And there's something called private property, et cetera, et cetera. Neoliberalism is more a philosophical and governmental belief that the government should just, you've heard of the term laissez-faire and probably laissez-faire capitalism. And that dates back to Adam Smith and the notion, his famous phrase, when the tides rise, all boats lift equally, right? So if you have a thriving capitalist society, everybody benefits, whether you're a capitalist, in other words, an owner or a worker. It all works to everybody's benefit. And that's classic liberalism. What neoliberalism says is that the government should be absolutely out of people's lives, and that people naturally behave according to this notion of economic benefits. But the contradiction of neoliberalism is that, as you well know, from if you're in the United States and if your parents have ever torn out their hair trying to do their taxes, the government is absolutely involved in maintaining wealth of certain classes of people. Donald Trump was able to declare, well, we'll get to his taxes finally, but anybody who's in real estate, which is a big market, anybody who is a real estate manager, who takes a loss in real estate can write that off their taxes. Think of that. That's supposed to encourage being more and more speculative and all that. And we saw in 2008 how that completely ruined the global economy. So the government is absolutely involved in maintaining the economic privilege of some and not others. So neoliberalism on one hand tells ordinary people, do things on your own. We're going to get out of your life. You don't need us. You don't need welfare. Beneficent people like Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates will set up charities, and that's the way humans should relate. Government shouldn't try to manage person-to-person relationships. So neoliberalism is this intense individualism for some people, but then rampant collectivism for the elites. So the elites will protect themselves, and this is what happens when you have economic elites and political elites working together. And then for everybody else, it's what we call austerity. The state doesn't have any money, sorry. And think about the bailout that Trump has put forward for the pandemic. Very few small businesses are getting that money. And Kanye West got, what, $4 million out of it. So it's very clear that laissez-faire capitalism in the form of neoliberalism is an illusion.
Okay, so our next question comes from Emily, and she asks, how do you think the pandemic has affected Black Lives Matter demonstrations? Has it created more solidarity around racial injustice or suppressed protests?
Well, let me start this. I'm happy to answer questions by email as well. So if you think of something like tomorrow, please email me, and I'm happy to, even get on a Zoom call with somebody. So I really am interested in your questions. I think that the very fact that so many people did show up for demonstrations despite the pandemic is an incredible sign that made people go to the streets, and there's still people in the streets. There'll be more people in the streets because the injustices that we saw there have just amplified. I mean, the fact that we have unmarked federal troops literally kidnapping people, which is completely unconstitutional, holding them without charge, and then releasing them without a trial. I mean, is frankly, and I could talk another few hours about fascism. It is fascism. So the fact that the pandemic was going on in the midst of this shows there was tremendous solidarity. And a lot of the demonstrations had nurses and physicians. They had Red Cross tents that the police would come and destroy. So as much as this is a horrible moment in our history, I want to really convey the sense that there's an immense moment of hope as well, because I've never seen such impressive demonstrations. And I've been around for a long time. And these things, as I said, cut across class divisions, racial divisions, whether you're in New York, Boston, or whether you're in Modesto. I don't know about Modesto, but, in other words, small towns. So anyway, that's the way I would answer the relationship between the pandemic. I think the pandemic, if anything, made everybody feel commonly threatened by something.
And to what extent do you believe the government should be able to intervene with regulating the economy? Is there a point where too much regulation, and what checks and balances are in place to make sure the government doesn't abuse the power to regulate?
Well, that's the big question, because we have to think about what the government is, right? If a government is, as the founding fathers said, of, for, and by the people, then the people are regulating the economy, right? If we have a true democracy, I don't have any problem with the government regulating it, because it's a representative government that works for the people and is responsible to the people, right? On the other hand, if it's a government that's only serving the elites or the people that are paying, filling the campaign coffers, then of course I don't want the government, regulating the economy, because it's going to be partial. It's going to be undemocratic. So that's why, if you have a vibrant democracy, then you don't have to worry about institutions, because you are the institution. And you're going to say, well, that's such pie in the sky stuff, but that's the democratic principles. And we find in other nations in the world that this model called democratic socialism works not bad. Let me put it that way. We still don't have a utopia, right? But that doesn't mean that we don't have something admirable to work toward.
And David, what would you propose as an effective way to discuss all of the topics we've talked about today, especially those pertaining to race, with people who are less accepting of diversity or insistent that all lives matter and taking that stance?
That is the, I don't know, factoring for inflation, that's a $40 billion question. And I always get the same answer. It really, and this is why I wish you were all literature students, because rhetoric, the field of rhetoric tells us that when you converse, when you speak, always be mindful, as the question asks us to be, of who you're talking to. Because the way you interact with people, obviously if they're friends of yours, then you can talk in much different ways, and the way that you might persuade them is different from, again, given the case that you just floated, which is the one that's most vexing for us, with people that you just know don't feel the same way. The problem is that, and I've never seen the world as polarized as it is today. It's terrible. And everybody feels compelled to take a position, but there are only two, right? So it's already a bad situation where you feel like you have to say something, it has to be one or the other. And if it's the wrong answer, then you're a horrible human being. And the whole idea of dialogue and conversation is gone. So how do we get away from this? One, if you know it's going to be a difficult conversation because of the topic and the people you're conversing with, don't use labels and don't cite other people. Because the first thing that will kill that conversation is defensiveness. And we are all defensive right now because we are all so freaked out. So don't use labels, because that automatically reduces complex issues into a label. And don't label other people, because that reduces complex human beings into simple entities. See what you have in common, right? And if you watched, Bernie Sanders did a town hall after the last presidential election. He lost. He went on Fox News talking about going into an audience that you know is not going to be receptive. He went to Fox News, and if you can find it on YouTube, watch it. Because he didn't go in and start talking about socialism or capitalism or, the Republicans. He went and said, okay, what do you want in your life? Can we all agree what we want, what we think a good life is? Do we want health and education? And, just what kind of world do we want for our kids if we have kids? Or what kind of world would we want to enable us to even think of having kids? And by the end of the town hall, people loved Bernie Sanders because he was talking to them. He was not talking through a mask or talking to them as if they were the enemy. And you're not going to get absolute consensus, obviously, but you're going to have a conversation, which is a huge stride forward. Because I think we all want the same. We want to be left at peace. We don't want to feel threatened by anything, right? Whether it be people that look different or whether it's the police. So how do we get to that world? That's where it gets tricky. But you can't get to that step before you first get some point of agreement. You have to find common ground, even if it's not exactly what you want in life. That's what compromise is all about. So there's no ideal solution, but that's the only thing that's worked kind of for me. So try that.
Thanks, David. And we have time for one last question. So for those who were not able to make the protests or maybe thinking about different ways to get involved, what suggestions do you have for students who are looking to show that they care about Black Lives Matter and to get involved in the Black community? Is there anything that you would recommend?
Oh, well, there's a great New York Times op-ed by Michelle Alexander that came out last few weeks. You can Google Michelle Alexander, New York Times. I think it's called America's Last Chance. And she has a part it goes exactly to that question. And the first thing I would say is get educated. I mean, just read up on history, understand what this is all about. Because before then, you can act. I mean, I'm not saying you have to read 1,000 books before you do so, but your activism will be much more effective if you are sure of what you're doing. We can't all be absolutely sure every time of everything. But so at one moment she says, here are some books to read. Start a reading group. And then after you have your reading group, start a political action group, right? Since now you've had a conversation, you have people on board and things like that. So I would say read, discuss, learn. If you develop some skepticism about what labels start floating around that you have to sign on to, take some time and understand what it's about. So, and I would say even with Black Lives Matter, I mean, we might be rightfully sentimentally behind it, and I would say go ahead and support it, but know more about why you should support it, because that will make your energy and your conviction that much more great.
Thank you so much, David, for this wonderful talk. One thing that you said at the very beginning really struck me. You said, the power to change things is not beyond you. And I think that your whole talk really fed into that optimism that you just exude. So thank you to everyone who joined us today. We loved seeing you here, and thanks for your great questions.